Cyrus Bellwether, confronted publicly with evidence he could not explain away, attempted first to discredit the ledger as a forgery, and then, when the county's own handwriting expert confirmed the writing matched samples of Rourke's known correspondence held in the old bank's employment records, he attempted to flee the county that same evening, only to be apprehended by the sheriff at the edge of town, his wagon loaded with as much of his liquid wealth as he could carry in haste. Justice, when it came, was not dramatic, but was, in its own way, complete. Bellwether's remaining assets, including the mortgages he held over a third of the valley's farms and ranches, were seized by the county to satisfy the decade-old debts owed to the families he had originally robbed, and he himself was sent to stand trial in the territorial court at Cheyenne. His reputation and his fortune both dismantled in the space of a single season. What mattered most to Louisa, however, was not Bellwether's downfall, but what became possible because of it. The recovered funds from Rourke's strongbox, modest as they were, became the seed of a new depositor's fund, and Louisa, working alongside Judge Hargrove and a handful of the valley's older, more trusted ranchers, helped establish it not as a bank controlled by any single powerful man, but as a cooperative trust owned collectively by the families who deposited into it, governed by a simple charter that guaranteed no single person could ever again hold the kind of unchecked power Bellwether had wielded. The seized mortgages were renegotiated at fair rates by the county, saving no fewer than 11 families from losing their land in that first winter alone. And Silas Rourke, dead for over a decade and remembered only as a thief, was formally and publicly cleared of the crime that had defined his memory, his name restored not to glory, since he had, after all, fled rather than face trial in his own time, but to the more modest and more truthful legacy of a man who had tried, however imperfectly, to do right by people who had trusted him. Louisa herself declined any significant personal share of the recovered funds beyond what was needed to repay the debts she had accumulated since arriving in Larkspur Creek, choosing instead to accept a small, steady position managing the new cooperative trust ledgers, a role for which her father's old lessons in arithmetic and fairness had, without either of them ever knowing it, prepared her from childhood. It is worth returning, now, to where this story began, to a 20-year-old woman standing outside a pawnshop window with a single silver dollar in her palm, watched by men who found her purchase worth nothing but a laugh. Louisa Hartwell did not buy a dead outlaw's map because she believed in treasure, and she did not follow its bearing into the canyon country because she was reckless or naive, as Larkspur Creek so quickly assumed. She followed it because her father had taught her to see value where others saw only waste, to read the quiet evidence of a landscape or a life rather than the loud assumptions people made about both, and because he had given her a stubborn, unglamorous belief that fairness mattered even when no one was watching to reward it. The map itself was never the true treasure. It was only ever the vessel for a decade-old truth that a wronged man had died trying to tell, and it took a young woman with nothing left to lose, and everything her father had taught her still intact, to finally listen. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Louisa Hartwell's story. If it moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who might need to hear it today, and we would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. So we leave you with this question to sit with. What is a time in your own life when you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Until next time, stay close. She was 20 years old, and she had been left in the desert to die. The man who cast her out was Silas Croft, her late father's business partner, and he did it so that no one would ever question who owned the land he meant to keep. All she carried into that wilderness was $4.30 sewn into the hem of her petticoat, and when she finally stumbled half-blind into the town of Prospect Wells 3 days later, she spent 3 of those dollars on a worthless, sun-cracked homestead claim along a dry riverbed that everyone said had been empty of water and hope alike for 20 years. It was a foolish purchase. Anyone in town would have told her so, and several did, right to her face. But sealed beneath the floor of that abandoned dugout was something that no one in Prospect Wells had gone looking for in 2 decades, something that would not only save her life a second time, but would answer, at last, the question of where the town's water had gone and why. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Louisa Merritt. If you have ever been told that what you carry has no worth, that the thing you love or the place you come from is used up and forgotten, tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Louisa Merritt had grown up believing that water was a language, and that her father was one of the few men left who could still read it. Amos Merritt was not a rancher, nor a miner, nor a merchant, though he had tried his hand at all three before Louisa was old enough to remember. He was a diviner, a well digger, a man who could walk a stretch of sun-baked nothing with a forked branch of willow in his two hands and tell you, with a confidence that unsettled strangers and comforted neighbors, exactly where to sink a shaft and how deep you would have to go before you struck something worth drinking. He had learned it from his own father in the hill country of Missouri, and long before Louisa was old enough to understand what it meant to be poor, he had begun teaching it to her, out of loneliness as much as tradition, because her mother had died delivering her, and there had never been another child and never another wife. She remembered him walking her out past the edge of whatever town they were passing through that season, his boots raising small clouds of dust, his voice low and patient as he explained how the willow branch was not magic, whatever the townsfolk liked to whisper, but a kind of attention. You did not find water by wanting it badly enough, he told her. You found it by learning to notice what the land already knew and had simply stopped announcing. A stand of cottonwood where there should be none. A faint green vein of grass cutting through gray scrub. The particular coolness of air moving up out of a wash at dusk. He taught her to read the shape of old riverbeds the way other fathers taught their daughters to read scripture, with the same reverence, the same insistence that this was a kind of truth that did not change no matter who refused to believe it. By the time she was 16, Louisa could out-divine half the men her father worked alongside, though she was rarely permitted to say so out loud, since a girl with a willow branch was a curiosity that towns tolerated only so long as she stood a respectful distance behind her father and let him speak the words over her findings. She did not mind the arrangement, not truly, because what she wanted was not credit but competence, the deep and private satisfaction of laying her palm against the earth and knowing, before the shovel ever broke ground, that there was good water sleeping 22 feet down. Her father called her his true daughter for it, his best pupil, and told her more than once that a woman who could find water would never starve. Not truly, not the way other kinds of poverty could starve a person, because water was the one thing that every soul on the frontier needed and could not manufacture out of pride. It was this skill and the small, hard-won savings that came from it that led Amos Merritt to Prospect Wells in the spring of 1885, a modest cattle and freight town clinging to the edge of the Arizona Territory, where the land turned the color of old rust and the wind carried grit instead of rain. He had been hired there by a cattleman named Silas Croft, a broad, soft-spoken man with a gambler's patience and a preacher's smile, to help locate new water sources for a herd expansion Croft was planning. The two men struck up what looked, from the outside, like a genuine partnership. Amos provided the knowledge of the land. Croft provided the capital and the connections, and within 2 years they had together secured a modest but respectable ranch a few miles outside town, water rights included, registered jointly under both their names at the Territorial Land Office. For the first time in Louisa's life, her father owned something that could not be packed onto a wagon and moved to the next town when the well ran dry. She turned 19 that spring, and for a short while, life in Prospect Wells felt to her like the closest thing to permanence she had ever known. She helped keep the ranch's books, since her father's handwriting had always been better suited to tally marks and sentences, and she spent her evenings teaching herself to read land surveys and county filings so thoroughly that the clerk at the land office began greeting her by name. She was not beautiful in the way that drew attention in a crowded room, but she had her father's steady gray eyes and an unhurried way of speaking that made people trust her before they quite knew why, and more than one young man in Prospect Wells had begun finding reasons to ride past the Merritt Ranch on errands that could easily have waited. Louisa noticed and was flattered, and was in no hurry because for the first time she was learning what it felt like to belong somewhere instead of merely passing through it, and she wanted to hold on to that feeling a while longer before she let anything else complicate it. Her father's health began failing that autumn. Quietly at first, a cough that lingered longer than it should have, a tiredness that no amount of sleep seemed to answer. By the following spring, he was confined to his bed more often than not, and it was Louisa who rode out to the wells they had located together, Louisa who spoke with the ranch hands, Louisa who, more and more, was the one who kept Silas Croft's expansion moving forward while her father grew thinner in the house behind her. Croft was solicitous during this time, visiting often, bringing a doctor from as far as Tucson twice at his own expense. And Louisa was grateful enough for his kindness that she did not think to question, as perhaps she should have, exactly how much of the ranch's daily business he had quietly begun steering into paperwork that only he fully understood. Amos Merritt died in the first week of June, in the small hours of the morning, with Louisa holding his hand and the window open to let in what little cool the desert night still offered. He had time, in his last lucid days, to tell her only that she had nothing to fear, that the ranch was hers by right and by law, that Croft was an honest man whatever his faults, and that she was, in every way that mattered, more capable than either of them had ever given her credit for out loud. It was, Louisa would later understand, the kindest and most incomplete thing her father ever told her, because he died believing it, and because he had never once imagined that the partnership he had built with his own two hands could be dismantled by a signature he had never fully read. The fall came swiftly, and it came dressed as sympathy. Within a week of the funeral, Silas Croft called Louisa into the ranch office and explained, with the gentle patience of a man delivering unwelcome medical news, that her father had, in the last difficult year of his illness, taken out several loans against his half of the ranch to cover the doctor's visits and the household expenses, loans that Croft himself had extended out of friendship rather than see the Merritts go without, and that these debts now fell, as was only proper, upon the estate. He produced documents bearing her father's shaking, unmistakable signature, dated across the very months when Amos had been most confused by fever and pain, and he explained, still gently, that the value of those debts, once totaled against the ranch's worth, left Louisa with nothing owed to her but goodwill and, if she wished, a small severance to help her start fresh somewhere else. She was 20 years old, unmarried, without a living relative closer than a great-aunt in Missouri she had never met, and she had no one in Prospect Wells with the standing or the inclination to challenge a respected cattleman's paperwork on behalf of a grieving girl. She signed what she was given to sign, because she did not yet understand that she had any other choice, and 3 days later she was seated on a freight wagon bound east, out of the only town that had ever felt like home, with a single trunk of belongings and Croft's hired driver, a taciturn man named Reyes, at the reins. It was Reyes who left her in the desert, whether he did it on Croft's explicit instruction or his own initiative to please a man he depended on for work. Louisa never learned for certain, though she had her suspicions, hardened over time into something close to certainty. 2 days out from Prospect Wells, on a stretch of road where the near settlement was better than 30 miles in any direction, the wagon's rear axle broke, or was made to appear broken, and Reyes informed her that he would have to ride ahead alone for parts and would return within the day. He left her the trunk, a canteen half full of warm water, and a strip of shade beneath the tilted wagon bed, and he did not come back. She waited a full day and through the following night before she understood, with a cold clarity that frightened her more than the heat did, that he was not coming back at all, that a girl who vanished quietly in the desert would raise far fewer questions in a land office than one who returned to contest a will. She survived those 3 days because her father had spent 19 years teaching her to read a landscape that most people saw only as punishment. She abandoned the trunk on the second morning, keeping only the canteen, a knife, and the small drawstring purse sewn into her petticoat, and she began walking not toward the road, which offered no guarantee of another traveler before her water gave out, but toward a distant, unlikely line of cottonwood trees she spotted at dusk, a stand of green in a country that offered green to nothing without reason. Her father's voice walked with her the whole way, patient and low, reminding her that water called its own kind of company even in ruin, that a line of trees and poor soil meant moisture below, even if none showed above, that despair was simply attention turned against itself. She reached the trees by the third evening, found beneath them a stagnant but drinkable seep, and 2 days after that, half-starved and blistered and nearly delirious with thirst, she walked into the outskirts of a town that a passing freighter told her was called Prospect Wells. Though it took her a full confused hour to understand that the desert had, by whatever cruelty or mercy governed such things, delivered her back to the very town she had been driven out of, only from a different direction than the road she had left on. She arrived on the day of a county land auction, penniless but for $4.30, her clothes in rags, her face and hands burned dark by 3 days of open sun, and utterly unrecognized by the small crowd gathered outside the land office, since the girl they remembered had left town clean and composed on a freight wagon, and the woman standing among them now looked like something the desert itself had spat back out. She had come to the land office not out of any plan, but out of simple habit, the same clerk's counter where she had once spent so many patient evenings. And it was there, standing at the edge of the auction crowd, trying to decide whether she had strength enough to ask a stranger for water, that she heard the auctioneer call out a parcel that made her lift her head. It was a homestead claim along Dry Coyote Wash, an abandoned dugout and 40 acres of scrub that had passed through 3 owners in 20 years, none of whom had managed to make anything of it, because the wash for which it was named had run dry sometime before Louisa was even born and had never run again, leaving the land as worthless as land could be in a country where worth was measured entirely in water. The auctioneer, half joking, opened the bidding at $3, and when no one in the crowd bothered to raise a hand for a piece of ground that everyone agreed was cursed with bad luck and worse soil, Louisa heard herself speak the words before she had fully decided to say them. $3, she said, and because there was no other bidder, and because the auctioneer was eager to be rid of the parcel and move on to better business, the claim was hers within the minute, transferred in her name on a scrap of paper that the clerk hardly looked twice at, since no one in that room believed the land was worth the ink. She told herself, walking the 4 miles out to the claim on legs that barely held her, that she had bought it only because it was cheap enough to afford, and because a roof, even a collapsing sod roof, over an empty dugout, was better than another night beneath open sky. It did not occur to her until she was standing in the doorway of the dugout itself, looking down the long, pale scar of the dry riverbed that gave the claim its name, that some quieter part of her, the part her father had spent 19 years training, had recognized something in the shape of that wash the moment the auctioneer called its name. A memory of a lesson about old rivers that do not truly die, but only go looking for a different way to be forgotten. The dugout was smaller than any home she had lived in, a single low room cut into the rise of a hillside with walls of packed earth and a roof of brush and mud that had partly collapsed at one corner, letting in a shaft of failing evening light. It smelled of dust and old smoke and the particular staleness of a place that had not sheltered a living soul in years. She found, in the back corner, a stove gone to rust, a single broken chair, and a floor of hard-packed clay that some previous owner had at least had the sense to lay flat and even. She was too exhausted that first night to do anything but drag the broken chair against the door and sleep on the bare clay floor, wrapped in nothing but the ragged remains of her own shawl, and it was only the following morning, when she woke stiff and hollow with hunger and began pacing the small room out of restlessness while she waited for enough strength to walk into town and beg for work, that her bare foot found a section of the clay floor that gave, ever so slightly, beneath her weight. It took her the better part of an hour, working with nothing but the broken chair leg and her own stubbornness, to pry up the flat stone slab hidden beneath a thin skin of packed clay near the room's rear wall. Beneath it was a shallow cavity, dry and undisturbed, lined with what had once been oilcloth and now crumbled at the edges like old moth wings, and inside the oilcloth, wrapped again in a stiffened square of buckskin, she found a leather ledger book, a folded survey map gone soft and brown with age, and a small tin box that, when she pried it open with trembling fingers expecting coin and finding none, held instead a bundle of letters tied with a strip of rawhide and a single brass surveyor's marker stamped with a date she did not recognize and a name she did. The name stamped into the brass marker was Ezra Coldwell, and it took Louisa the better part of that first day, hungry and light-headed as she was, turning the pages of the ledger by the light through the broken roof, to understand who Ezra Coldwell had been and why his name, 40 years buried beneath a stranger's floor, made the hair rise on her arms. The ledger was a watermaster's record, kept in careful, cramped handwriting, detailing the construction in the early 1840s of an earthen and timber flume system that had once carried water from a spring high in the hills above Prospect Wells down through what the ledger called the Coldwell Cut, into the very riverbed on which Louisa now stood, a wash that the ledger insisted, again and again, in language growing steadily more anxious across its final pages, had run with real and reliable water. For the better part of 2 decades before the entries simply stopped. She spent that night and the following day, weak with hunger but unwilling to leave the dugout until she understood what she was holding, piecing together a story that the ledger told only in fragments, and that the bundle of letters, once she worked up the nerve to untie them, filled in with a bitterness that time had not softened. Ezra Coldwell had been the original homesteader of the claim she now owned, and the true architect, 40 years past, of the very water system that had once made Prospect Wells possible at all, a diversion of a mountain spring that had been the town's true lifeblood long before anyone remembered it that way. The letters, written by Coldwell to a territorial water commissioner in a hand grown increasingly desperate, accused a group of the town's founding cattlemen, men whose names Louisa recognized from the weathered lettering on Prospect Wells' oldest buildings, of conspiring to seal the flume and reroute the spring entirely onto their own private grazing land, starving the public wash dry so that the water, and the immense grazing rights that followed it, would belong to a small circle of men, rather than the town as a whole. Coldwell had fought the decision in every legal channel available to a poor homesteader against wealthy ranchers, had been ruined for his trouble, and had vanished from the record entirely sometime in the 1850s, his claim passing through the county's hands, and then through 3 anonymous owners who had known nothing of what lay beneath the dugout's floor, because Coldwell, in his last letter, dated only weeks before the correspondence ended, had written that he intended to hide his proof somewhere safe until a day came when justice, or at least honesty, might finally be affordable again. What made Louisa's breath catch, reading that last letter twice over in the dimming light, was not merely the age of the injustice, but its shape, because the very families whose names Coldwell had accused, cross-referenced against the ledger's careful listing of original water shareholders, included a name that had married into the Croft line 2 generations back, and because the flume itself, according to Coldwell's map, had been sealed not with dynamite or fire, but with a deliberately engineered earthen dam built directly above the very ranch land that Silas Croft now held, water rights and all, in his own name. The dry riverbed running past her new and worthless claim had not gone dry by any act of nature. It had been murdered quietly and profitably by men who had then spent 40 years letting the whole town believe that its lifeblood had simply, tragically, run out. She did not sleep well that night, though not from hunger alone. She understood, turning the surveyor's marker over and over in her blistered palm, that what she held was not merely an old grievance, but a living deed, because the ledger's final pages, in Coldwell's own careful legal hand, recorded that the original water rights to the spring, unlike the grazing land itself, had never been sold or transferred, only interrupted, and that whoever held clear title to the Coldwell claim, and could prove the original diversion, held a legitimate and still standing claim to the water itself. She was no lawyer, but she had spent 2 years reading land filings alongside her father, and she knew enough to understand that what looked from town like a worthless dry patch of scrub was in fact the single most valuable piece of paper in the entire county, if only she could prove it and survive long enough to try. She walked into Prospect Wells the following morning on legs still unsteady with hunger, and it was there, buying a half loaf of bread with the last of her $4 from a baker's wife who did not recognize the burned, thin face of the girl who had once kept the Merritt Ranch books, that Louisa first understood how thoroughly Silas Croft had rewritten her own story in her absence. The baker's wife, making idle conversation, mentioned without malice that old Croft had spoken sadly at church only weeks before the tragic young woman who had once been like a daughter to him, gone out east to relatives after her father's death. May the Lord watch over her travels. Louisa said nothing, paid for her bread with a hand that did not shake nearly as much as she expected it to, and walked back out to the wash with a resolve settling into her chest that felt, for the first time since her father's death, less like grief and more like purpose. It took her 3 careful weeks to build what she needed before she dared approach anyone with her claim, because she understood, better than most 20-year-old women might have, that a torn and hungry girl accusing the town's most respected cattleman of 40-year-old water theft would be laughed out of the land office unless she arrived with proof too solid to dismiss. She traded labor for food where she could, mending and washing for the boarding house in exchange for meals, and she spent every spare hour she could steal walking the length of the dry wash with her father's old willow branch method, not merely dowsing now, but mapping, matching Coldwell's 40-year-old survey against the actual lay of the land, confirming with her own 2 hands and her own trained instinct that the springs still ran, high in the hills, exactly where the ledger said it should, sealed behind an earthen dam grown over now with brush, but unmistakable in its deliberate construction to anyone who knew what to look for. She copied Coldwell's ledger entries by lamplight into a fresh notebook, in case the original was ever taken or destroyed, and she wrote, in her own careful hand, a full accounting of everything the documents proved, cross-referenced against the county's own water rights filings, which she was able to inspect openly at the land office precisely because no one there yet recognized the ragged young woman quietly requesting old records as the same Louisa Merritt who had once sat behind that very counter. She made one further discovery in those 3 weeks that steadied her more than any legal argument could have. Tucked into the very back of Coldwell's ledger, in a hand that grew shaky with age but never lost its clarity, was a final entry recording that he had, before his health failed him entirely, taught the rudiments of water divining to a young apprentice from a nearby ranch, a boy he described only as promising and patient, whose family name. When Louisa found it recorded once more in a faded church ledger she tracked down at the request of the aging pastor, turned out to be Merritt. It was, she understood with a sudden ache behind her eyes, entirely possible that the very skill her father had passed down to her across 19 patient years, the skill that had saved her life twice over in that desert and in this dugout, had itself descended from Ezra Coldwell's own hands, a thread of knowledge that had traveled quietly through 2 generations to arrive, entirely by what felt less like accident and more like inheritance, back at the doorstep of the very injustice it had begun with. Word travels quickly in a small town, and it was inevitable that Silas Croft would learn, before Louisa was fully ready, that the girl he believed dead or scattered had not only survived, but had been seen walking the old Coldwell claim with a surveyor's chain and a notebook. He came to her at the dugout himself, riding out alone in the golden hour before sunset with the same gentle, patient smile he had always worn, and he did not bother, this time, to pretend surprise at finding her alive, which told Louisa more clearly than any confession could have exactly how much he had known about Reyes and the broken axle all along. He offered her money first, a sum larger than she had ever possessed, framed as compassion for a grieving orphan starting fresh. And when she did not immediately accept it, his gentleness thinned by careful degrees into something colder, a reminder, delivered still in that same soft voice, that a friendless young woman with no family and no standing in the county would find it very difficult indeed to make trouble for a man as respected and as connected as himself, and that claims against. Powerful men had a way of causing more harm to the ones who raised them than to the ones they were raised against. Louisa told him, with a steadiness that surprised her even as she spoke it, that she had not come to make trouble, only to correct a mistake that was 40 years old and not her doing, and that she intended to bring her documents before the county water commissioner within the week regardless of what he offered or threatened. Croft left without another word, but within 2 days the trouble he had promised arrived in smaller, meaner forms, men hired to ride past the dugout at night shouting threats into the dark, A rumor spread through town that the Merritt girl had come back touched in the head by her ordeal and was not to be trusted with anything so serious as land claims. And finally, on the fourth night, an attempt, thwarted only because Louisa had taken to sleeping with a ledger and letters hidden beneath a loose board beneath her own bedding rather than in the original cavity, to burn the dugout to the ground while she was away in town. She returned to find the structure scorched but standing, the fire having caught poorly against damp earthen walls, and she understood then that Croft was frightened in a way that no amount of gentle smiling could disguise, and that fear, in a man who had spent 40 years believing his family's theft was safely buried, was the surest sign she had that her proof was strong enough to matter. She brought her case not to the county water commissioner alone, which she feared Croft's influence might still reach, but to the territorial newspaper in the county seat, riding the 2 days there on a borrowed mule with the ledger, the letters, and her own careful notes wrapped against her body beneath her clothes. And she told her story to an editor named Mr. Whitfield, who had built his paper's reputation on exposing exactly the kind of quiet frontier corruption that respectable men preferred stay buried. He verified her documents against the territorial archives himself before he agreed to print a word. And when the story finally ran, 2 weeks later, under a headline that named both Ezra Coldwell's 40-year-old injustice and Silas Croft's family's long profit from it, the effect on Prospect Wells was immediate and total. The county water commissioner, unwilling to be seen dragging his feet on so public a matter, ordered an official survey of the Coldwell cut within days, and it confirmed, exactly as Louisa's own dowsing had already told her, that the earthen dam sealing the spring stood squarely on land registered to Silas Croft, built, according to the surveyor's own careful dating of the construction, at almost precisely the time the historical record showed the wash running dry. The town's reaction was not what Louisa had feared and not entirely what she had hoped either, which was, she came to understand, closer to the truth of how justice actually arrives in a small place than any clean and satisfying reckoning could have been. There was outrage, certainly, and a hastily called town meeting in which several of Prospect Wells' older families discovered with considerable discomfort that their own ancestors had been named in Coldwell's letters as quiet beneficiaries of the theft. But there was also, cutting through the outrage, a fierce and immediate practical hunger, because a town that had spent 40 years hauling water from a distant well at considerable cost and considerable hardship understood within hours of the survey's confirmation that a working spring stood sealed less than 3 miles from its main street, and there was very little patience left once that fact settled in, for punishing anyone before the water itself was freed to run again. Louisa found herself, in the strange days that followed, less a plaintiff seeking justice and more the only person in the county who actually understood how to unseal a 40-year-old dam without collapsing the spring source entirely. And it was here, at last, that her father's teaching and Ezra Coldwell's own buried knowledge came together in her hands with a satisfaction that felt, to her, more like homecoming than triumph. She walked the site with the county surveyor and a crew of volunteer townsmen, reading the old construction against Coldwell's original map, marking exactly where the earthen fill could be cut away without loosing an uncontrolled flood down onto the grazing land below, and she stood at the head of the wash on the morning the crew finally broke through the final barrier of packed earth, close enough to feel the cool exhale of air that rose up from water that had been waiting, patient and undiminished, in the dark for 40 years. It came slowly at first, a trickle no wider than a handspan working its way down the ancient channel it had once called home, and then, as the crew widened the breach through the afternoon, it came in earnest, a living ribbon of water pushing its way down the ancient scar of Dry Coyote Wash for the first time since before Louisa Merritt had been born, soaking in a ground so long parched that it drank the first hours of flow entirely before beginning, toward evening, to pool and run visibly. Again in the low places, exactly as her father had once told her thirsty land always eventually would, if you were only patient enough to let it remember how. Half the town had walked out to watch by then, and there was a stillness among them as the water reached the old original channel markers, a quiet that Louisa understood, standing at its edge with dust and 40 years of buried grief on her hands, as something closer to reverence than celebration. The particular hush of people watching a wrong finally, undeniably, begin to be set right. Silas Croft did not face a noose or a jail cell, because the theft, however cruel, had happened decades before he was born and the legal reckoning fell. In the end, mostly on paper, a forced renegotiation of water rights that stripped his family's exclusive claim and restored the spring to public and Coldwell-descended ownership, as the original filings had always intended. But the town's memory proved a harder court than any judge, and a man who had built his standing on being trusted found that standing collapsed within a single season. His cattle contracts quietly withdrawn, his seat on the town council vacated at the next election, without a challenger even needing to campaign against him. His name spoken in Prospect Wells from then on, not as a benefactor, but as a cautionary footnote to the story everyone now told about the girl who had followed a dry riverbed home. He sold what remained of his diminished holdings within the year and left the territory altogether. And Louisa, when she heard the news secondhand at the boarding house, found that she felt not triumph, but a kind of tired, settled peace, the particular relief of a debt finally closed rather than a victory finally won. She thought often, in the months that followed, about the girl who had stood in that same auction crowd 4 months earlier, burned and starving, and certain that $3 spent on a worthless dugout was the last foolish act of a life that had run entirely out of better options. She understood now that the desert had not simply spared her by accident, and that Reyes and Croft, in leaving her to die on that empty stretch of road, had unwittingly delivered her to the one place on earth suited to teach her exactly what she needed to know, because her father's patient lessons about reading a landscape that others had given up on had been, all along, preparing her for a single dry wash and the buried truth sleeping beneath it. Settle in, she might have said to that earlier version of herself, if such a thing were possible, because the story is not finished, and what looks like the end of everything is sometimes only the driest stretch before the water finds its way home. Her name, once spoken in Prospect Wells with pity or forgetfulness, was spoken now the way a town speaks of the people who saved it, and she had done it not by seizing what the discovery might have made her, a wealthy woman with sole claim to a spring the whole county depended on, but by insisting, over the objections of more than one well-meaning lawyer, that the water rights be restored to the public wash exactly as Ezra Coldwell had always intended them, because she had learned from her father that the true measure of finding something valuable was not what you could keep for yourself, but what you could finally let flow to everyone who had gone without it. Thank you for spending this evening with us and with Louisa Merritt, a young woman who was left for nothing and became, in the end, the reason an entire town remembered how to trust its own ground again. If her story moved you, we would be grateful if you would share it with someone who needs a reminder that what looks worthless to everyone else can still be waiting quietly to change everything. We would love to know, in the comments below, about a time you found real value in something the world around you had already written off, whether it was a person, a place, or simply a chance nobody else believed in. Until next time, stay close.